Wealthy people never pay all cash for assets because they understand how the concept of leverage can build wealth. Hey everyone, it's Kaya here and welcome back to my channel where we simplify real estate investing concepts and I can show you how to be a wealth multiplier just like me. Now, leverage is an incredibly underrated concept. Once you grasp how leverage can help you scale and build your real estate portfolio, you'll start to realize that getting from 0 to 1 rental property is a lot harder than scaling to multiple rental properties after you get your first. You'll definitely be surprised at how quickly your real estate portfolio grows once you understand how to harness the power of leverage. Now, this is the definition of leverage. We are using borrowed money to amplify your returns. That's correct. Using other people's money to amplify your return on investment. So when we leverage, we're using borrowed money, typically from a lender or from a bank, to buy an appreciating asset like real estate. This allows you to control a much larger asset without contributing a whole lot of your own capital. Now, personally, I don't like putting all my eggs in one basket, and I like diversifying my portfolio as much as possible. So, unfortunately, at this stage in my life, I don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars just laying around to play with. So I have to be extra strategic with how I'm using my cash on hand to invest. Now, here's why leverage with real estate is such a game changer. You get to enjoy 100% of the property's appreciation and cash flow, even though you put down a relatively small amount of your own capital. But hey, don't take it from me. Let's go through an example. So we're going to compare two different scenarios, without leverage and with leverage, and we're going to calculate how your ROI is going to change depending on whether or not you choose to use leverage. Now, let's say you have $100,000 of your own money that you want to invest in real estate with. So without leverage, you have $100,000 to play with. So that means that your property that you can afford to buy is going to be $100,000. And since we are not using leverage, this is going to be an all cash purchase, which means it's $100,000 of your own sweet, sweet money. And for completeness, let's just remember that our mortgage is going to be $0 because you put in $100,000 of your own cash to buy a $100,000 property. Now, let's assume that we have a 5% appreciation rate for the real estate market in which we're investing in. So that means that after 1 year, your property will have appreciated by $5,000. Now we're gonna do our ROI calculation using two different figures. We're gonna be using this gains of $5,000 and your cash that you put in, which is going to be $100,000. So therefore, your ROI is going to be 5%. So now let's take a look at an example when you do use leverage in a real estate purchase. So we're working with the same amount of cash, you still have $100,000 to play with. Now the difference here is we're gonna use leverage. So in this example, let's assume that we're gonna go through a mortgage lender and we're gonna get a loan on our real estate asset. So we can actually buy a property that is worth $500,000 because we're putting 20% down. So 20% of that $500,000 is going to be that $100,000 that we were originally talking about. That means that your mortgage is going to be the difference between these two figures. So that's going to be $400,000. That's your mortgage balance. We're going to use the exact same assumption here that we have a 5% appreciation rate annually. But here's the difference. Because we have a much more expensive property, that 5% appreciation doesn't mean $5,000. That means that our gains are actually $25,000 because that 5% appreciation goes on top of the total property value every single year. Now we're going to do our ROI calculation. Now keep in mind, we have put in the exact same amount of money in both cases, $100,000 in both cases. The difference now is that now we have $25,000 of gains. So therefore, when you do use leverage, your ROI becomes 25%. Compare that to 5%. I mean, come on, it's a no-brainer. Now let's check out an example of why leverage is so critical for a strategy of real estate investing and just like house hopping. And for our house hopping example, we're going to use a $500,000 home as our sample property. Now, if you're unfamiliar with my house hopping strategy, it's essentially in a nutshell, a very beginner-friendly, creative real estate investing technique. Now, what I essentially do is I buy a house and I live in it for at least 2 years. Then I move out of that house and buy a new house. But instead of selling the old house, what I do is I turn it into a rental property and I have a tenant move into it or I Airbnb that house. And I keep hopping from house to house to house and turning the old house into a rental property. Now, this technique works really well for me because sometimes I only put 5% down, which in this example for a $500,000 property would be at $25,000. Now that's $25,000 of my own money that I'm putting into a real estate investment. That means that I'm gonna have a mortgage balance and it's gonna be the difference of these two. And let's assume that my interest rate is 7% because that's what it is right now, which means let's just assume that my monthly payment, including taxes, insurance, principal, and interest, is going to be $3,500. Now, these are the terms of my loan while I'm living inside the house. So during that time, I'm paying down my principal because I have my monthly payment being consistently paid every single month. And because I'm living there and I'm owning that house, my house is also appreciating in value every single year. Now, theoretically, my house would be appreciating every single year, but that's just not the reality of how the real estate market works. It is a cycle, and there are peaks and there are valleys, and that's just kind of how the cookie crumbles. But for the sake of our example, we're going to assume that it's going to appreciate the same rate every single year. Now, I'm going to move out of the house, and 2 years later, I'm turning it into a rental property. So 2 years have elapsed of me living there in the home, and several things have happened. Number one, my property is appreciating at a rate of 5% every year. Like I said, that's not how it actually works in real life, but for the sake of the example, let's just go with it. So we have 5% appreciation, which means that now, more or less, my property is worth $550,000. I'm making the numbers easy for the sake of clarity. So because I've been paying my mortgage payment every single month, now my balance is around $460,000. My monthly payment is not really changing. Yes, my property taxes are going to change year over year, but as a whole, this monthly payment is not really changing because my loan terms are not changing when I move out of the home and turn it into a rental property. Now, after I move out of the home, there's a very critical step, which is finding tenants to rent the rental property. And it all comes down to pricing rent correctly. If you price your rent too high, nobody's going to rent your rental property. If you price your rent too low, you're not going to get good quality tenants. So that brings me to my point of how do we calculate the tenant's rent? Now, the way that I go about calculating how much rent to charge for a property is by analyzing closed comps. By closed comps, I mean similar comparable properties to whatever property I'm trying to rent out and analyzing data for what rent amount they actually closed at, actually rented at. I do take into consideration active listings because those are going to be my competition, but as a whole, when I'm determining what price rent to charge, I'm always looking at closed comparable properties. And by comparable, I mean I'm looking at square footage, the age of the property, the quality of the property, backyard size, garage size, amenities, things like that, and bedrooms and bathrooms. So for this example, let's say I determine that my rent that I can charge is $3,700 per month. And PITI is your mortgage payment. It's just an acronym that stands for principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. If my payment is still around $3,500, well, now I can calculate my cash flow. So if I subtract these, I end up with a cash flow of $200 per month. Now, $200 a month doesn't sound particularly sexy, nothing to write home about, but it actually is in the grand scheme of leverage. Because what does this mean? This means that as I am owning an appreciating asset, right? Okay, it's appreciating at 5% every year. I bought it 2 years ago, it was worth $500,000. 2 years later, it's worth more or less $550,000. And keep in mind, I only put 25 grand of my own money into this property. I only put in $25,000. I've already gained my initial investment back and then some in terms of my ROI because this is a $50,000 difference and I only put half of that in. And additionally, the tenants are paying my mortgage on this appreciating asset. I'm not having to pay it. The great part about having cash flow is that now you can take that cash and put it in your reserves to save for a rainy day for any issues with your rental property or maintenance. Because make no mistake, there is no such thing as a free piece of real estate. Real estate is expensive to maintain. There are so many things that a homeowner and a real estate investor has to do every month, every quarter, every year to maintain their property. And the best way to prevent any major issues in your property is by doing routine preventative maintenance. Trust me, I learned that the hard way recently. Now, a lot of people get stuck on why 2 years? 2 years, 2 years, 2 years. Does it have to be 2 years? No, it doesn't have to be 2 years. 2 years is an arbitrary timeline that I kind of put on myself. Yes, there's kind of a tax implication there, having lived in the property for 2 years. It's called a Section 121 exclusion, and you should look it up on the IRS website. It's way more complicated than people make it out to be. But speaking personally, 2 years is kind of like my tolerance for how often I am willing to move. People ask me, can you do this technique of house hopping every single year? And I'm like, well, I guess you could, But moving every year, that kind of sounds terrible and I don't want to do that. So 2 years is like my tolerance for how often I am willing to put myself through the pain of moving and buying a new house. Now let's talk about the rent, because rent can be a little bit tricky. This time duration is also important because we're hoping that we have bought real estate in a strong rental market. Because let's say that the day I purchase my home and close on my home, whatever rent I could be charging on that day, I wouldn't cash flow. With an interest rate like 7%, it becomes very challenging to find real estate markets where you can cash flow immediately right off the bat. But the great part about this house hopping technique is that you're biding your time. And during that time, rents generally do go up. They do get more expensive. So during this 2-year duration, we're kind of hoping that rents are getting more and more expensive so that by the time we're ready to move out and rent out the old house, whatever rent we can charge fair market value will be enough to cover the mortgage and then some, hopefully. If it's break even, it's break even. At this point in the stage of the real estate market that we're in currently, if I'm breaking even on a property, I'm happy. Once you really internalize the concept of leverage, you will be so surprised at how easily and how quickly it is to build wealth and really embody being a wealth multiplier. I am so excited to be back on YouTube. I have so many more videos just like this coming, and I am launching a digital course all about how to get rich with real estate investing, a guide for beginners. If you want to be notified when the waitlist opens for that course, I'll leave a link down below so you can go sign up and be notified for when spots open. I'm very curious to hear y'all's feedback about videos like this with the whole lightboard setup. It's really fun for me to do because I'm a very visual learner. Like, that's just how I am. So I feel that it's much easier for me to explain things if I can actually draw things out and have numbers on the board. So if there are other wealth building concepts or real estate investing concepts that you really want covered, please let me know in the comments. I'm taking all kinds of suggestions. I'll be uploading on YouTube every single week, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any real estate investing content. Thank you so much for watching and spending this time with me. I love all my wealth multipliers, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!